Welcome all you brave souls for coming out to hear another Micron presentation. This is the regular CNY Solidarity Sunday meeting, and usually start off with any announcements. Either.
An announcement that just came out yesterday. Hughes for Peace in Syracuse is having a rally tomorrow, Monday, 5:30 p.m. in Clinton Square. Singing, speaking, and Hanukkah blessing, calling for a ceasefire in Israel. So that's it wasn't in the newsletter last week, but you can find him on Facebook looking for Andy Major. But 5:30 tomorrow at Clinton Square. Thanks.
Last but not least, just continuing recognition that we live on the land of the Haudenosaunee and Shawnee peoples, and we need to keep that in our thoughts. So today we will have a presentation about Micron, and we're going to talk about three things: the Micron issues in terms of the environment and sustainability and issues. And I'm going to do a short presentation on community benefits, potential community benefits that are associated with the Micron project, which have a lot to do with Micron's commitments. And we hope that we can do the three presentations in about an hour or so. And after that, there'll be a meeting of two committees, state and local action, and indivisible. So who's starting first? Dave Sonnenfeld. So the first presenter will be Dave Sonnenfeld, retired ESF professor.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out today. As Dick mentioned, there'll be three of us. I'm starting with a brief presentation of some overall points of reference, some kind of the big picture with regard to the proposed Micron semiconductor manufacturing facility here in the Syracuse area. I'll be followed by Don Hughes, who will zoom in on more information specifically on the environmental aspects of that proposed project. And then Dick will be the third panelist, so to speak, talking about some of the human and social community impacts of that proposed project. So I hope there'll be time after our presentations for you to raise specific questions. My aim today, as I mentioned a moment ago, is to present some points of reference, kind of big picture points of reference. I've organized that with 10 numbers. This number, it's a very large number, $100 billion. This is the proposed investment that Micron would make over the next 20 years at its proposed manufacturing facility near Clay in Onondaga County. One of the challenges with this proposed project, from my perspective, is one of scale. How do we get our heads around these really big numbers? One of the things that I am trying to do today in several of these slides, including this one, is present some comparisons. So by comparison, the annual or proposed annual budget for Onondaga County for all of its operations for 2024 is $1.5 billion. So you can think about the investment that's going into this proposed facility over the 20 years being significantly exceeding by several degrees over what the county spends on all of its operations in a current year. Next slide, please. Second point of reference, $27.6 billion. This is the number representing the proposed subsidies that the Micron project would have over a 20-year period. This includes $21 billion of federal income tax credits, over $5 billion of New York State income tax credits, almost 50 years of property tax abatement for Onondaga County, $244 million in New York State taxpayer support for discounted utility rates, and $200 million of county support for infrastructure improvements. A lot of that is with the expansion of the Oak Orchard wastewater treatment facility. Micron has stated that this proposed project is dependent upon receiving these subsidies. Time will tell whether Micron, which is for this particular project, which is one of more than 400 proposed projects under the Federal CHIPS and Science Act, will be funded through the U.S. Department of Commerce, which their application is pending. 9,000. This is the number of jobs that Micron projects, full-time permanent jobs at their facility, if it is built over a 20-year period. They propose that the facility be built in 4 components, 4 parts, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. It's a very large number, and Dick will talk about what the implications of that are in terms of employment and transportation and housing and other kinds of things. In addition to that 9,000, for the construction of the facility, they are projecting 4,500 construction jobs. The first phase, if it receives the necessary funding and subsidies, they hope to break ground in the fall of 2024, so not that long from now. We can talk more later about construction jobs and something called project labor agreements, which is one of the aspects of specifically the construction phase of the project that would involve cooperation with local area trade unions. 48 million gallons. Also a huge number and hard to get our heads around. The city of Syracuse uses the whole city 40 million gallons a day of water. At its fullest, if the Micron project is built with all 4 phases and all 4 semiconductor manufacturing facilities, the project is estimated to use up to 48 million gallons of water per day for its operations. The current water that's piped in to that area through pipes from Lake Ontario are not sufficient for the full project. It would require the construction of an additional major pipeline from Lake Ontario to the Glade facility to support that much water. 20 million gallons a day is the projected amount of wastewater that would be produced daily by this facility. This also, this amount would be projected over the 4 phases of the project. This also would require a significant expansion of the wastewater treatment facility at Oak Orchard, which is a county-operated facility. A significant part of the county's subsidy for this project would come through expansion of that facility, which at least in part would be supported by ratepayers and taxpayers in Onondaga County. PFAS, Don will talk more about this in a minute. It's an acronym standing for perfluoroalkyl and polyfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS. There are more than 15,000 of these chemicals. They are essential and integral to today's semiconductor manufacturing technology. They will be used at the Micron facility if it is built. And these are today largely unregulated. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency is moving in the direction of attempting to regulate them. They will begin with a much smaller subset of that 15,000 family of chemicals. These are persistent organic pollutants that bioaccumulate in humans and other living things. If this plant was built today, one of the major challenges for it from an environmental and a health perspective would be monitoring, detecting, mitigating whatever PFAS substances would be a part of that waste stream and potentially emitted through aerosol emissions as well. It's a big unknown. One of the provisions of the Federal Chips and Science Act that would fund this facility if it were to be built, but there's a separate provision for research and development. This is being led by the U.S. Department of Defense. And one of the missions of that effort would be to develop the semiconductor industry association is supportive of this, developing alternatives for the use of PFAS substances in semiconductor manufacturing. 16.17 billion kilowatt hours. This is an annual amount. This is the projected energy demand for the Micron facility over the course of a year. It's been stated, I have not confirmed, that this is comparable to the entire electric use of the states of Vermont and New Hampshire. So this is a very large number. And one of the interesting challenges for this facility that is being much discussed, including by Micron, is how this facility will meet the requirements of New York State's enabling legislation, the New York State Green Chips Act, which for state funding of this project would require the adoption of renewable energy sources and meeting the state's carbon emissions targets, quote unquote, over the lifetime of the project. There's also expectations and subsidies involved in New York State taxpayers providing discounts to Micron for the utility charges that it would be required. This is in cooperation with National Grid, which would provide that energy, but at a discounted rate for the first 10 years. Next slide, please. $500 million is what has been publicized widely as available in Central New York to support community development, social impact mitigation, workforce development, et cetera. I think Dick will talk about what is happening in this realm. These are mostly New York State provided funds. I understand Micron has contributed a modest portion of this. I don't know the exact number, but this is, there's a community engagement committee discussing, even as we speak, how to allocate those funds. And many of the local organizations and institutions are actively engaged in how might those funds be applied. Next slide, please. Number three, there are three lead agencies at the local level, the state level, and the federal level. Locally, it's the Onondaga County Industrial Development Agency, known by its acronym OCEDA. At the state level, it is a state agency that functions as a corporation, the Empire State Development Corporation. At the national level, the lead agency is a unit within the U.S. Department of Commerce. That unit is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. As you can see from the names of these three lead agencies, it is very much about economic development, and they are all working as hard and fast as they can to accelerate the decision-making and other kinds of planning for this project were it to proceed. The 10th number is 2. And I would like to share with you, and we can talk more about what this might entail, that there are both a local and a national, what I would characterize as an emergent coalition of folks who are working together. And this coalition includes the Central New York Solidarity Coalition as part of a larger Central New York Sustainability Coalition. It includes the local unit of the Sierra Club, which Don is conservation co-chair of, and others. At the national level, there's an emergent coalition called the CHIPS Communities United. This involves labor organizations, involves environmental organizations, including the Sierra Club at the national level. It involves former director of National Institutes of Health and others. I included here the website for that national level network and organization, chipscommunitiesunited.org, if that's something that might be of interest to you. Lastly, and I can make this available in other forms as there might be an interest, I would like to recommend several places for further learning about the proposed Micron project and the efforts that are happening around it. Some of you may have heard of this book by Chris Miller, recently published, 2022, Chip War, the Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology. This is a very accessible book talking about the global competition and essential character of semiconductors for the world that we live in today. And this provides a background and a rationale for why there is such strong bipartisan support in Congress in this age where we can't agree on anything else, why it's important to have semiconductor manufacturing again in the US. The Central New York Solidarity Coalition has a very complete and useful Micron project compilation of local resources. OSIDA has some key documents through its website. The New York State Empire Development Corporation also has a webpage which presents their view of this and related projects. And then for those of you who are interested in the environmental and health implications of this, the National Institute of Environmental Sciences has a top priority on developing scientific and health-oriented research on PFAS substances. And then lastly, the US EPA is in the early stages of just beginning to promulgate regulations related to PFAS. And I'll end there and turn this over to Don and welcome your comments and questions later on. Yeah.
Right, so I'm going to try not to bore you all too much with technical details, but necessarily we have to get into some technical aspects of this. As David talked about, PFAS, very critical element of this. So there we go. So that's Micron's publicity shot. So I'm Don Hughes. I've been active in environmental issues for many decades in the Syracuse area. My current hat is as the conservation chair of the local Sierra Club group. We used to be the Iroquois group, and now we've adopted a more politically correct but very lengthy name of Central and Northern New York group. I'm going to be talking about these major topics, and really to understand the whole picture here, I want to take a bit of a dive into chip manufacturing. I've been learning about it over the last few weeks. Just a little overview about chips manufacturing and the market for it. It's a major market, $500 to $600 billion. That red vertical line separates the past from the future, and it's expected to grow a lot.
you can see all the different uses listed on the right-hand side. Don't be thrown by the percentages, that's percent growth. But you can see that cars are a big chunk and all that kind of stuff. Pointers. Yeah. All these devices that we use. Here's one. This probably doesn't have memory in it, but certainly computers, my EV, all kind of whiz-bang stuff in it. So let's move on to the next thing here. So over the years, and this starts back in 1960, this is the evolution of semiconductors. And these things used to be kind of large and clunky, and they have gotten packed more and more transistors into tinier and tinier space over the years. And now we're down here. The scale here is in nanometers. And what I want to call your attention to here is on the right-hand side, this is the type of light that is used. So the process is called photolithography. So using light beams to etch a pattern into a silicon wafer. And as the size has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk and shrunk, we've had to go to higher and higher energy wavelengths, forms of light, because the wavelength gets shorter and shorter. All right, so extreme UV is the technology that Micron will be using. Okay, so how big is a micron? Micron, I've heard that. Yeah, so the name of the company is after the dimension of micron. So a micron is here, and the size of these chip junctions, nodes they call them, is down in here. So very, very tiny. So just a kind of overview of the chip manufacturing process here. So it's a multi-stage process. What I mainly want to call your attention to is there's all these steps with preparing the wafer. There's chemical inputs, lots of chemical inputs, both liquids and gases. And then the key step here is the exposure to the UV light. And that causes the pattern that essentially causes the pattern in the chip wafer, in the silicon wafer. And then you apply more chemicals and clean the thing off. Okay, so you're etching into it. It's like wood block cutting, only very tiny scale. So we have chemicals going in, we have energy going in, and we have waste products coming in. And that's what these devices look like. This is a facility in Albany. It's a nanotech complex there. These devices are made by one company and based in the Netherlands, and they cost upwards of $500 million each. And they come with a small army of technicians to keep them going. All those machines are in clean rooms inside. What we have as inputs is the water that David referred to, chemicals, which I'm going to talk about, and then coming out is wastewater and air emissions. And I'm going to address those two things. I'm not going to get into this because I don't know much about it. So let's talk about chemicals. So PFAS, per or polyfluorinated alkyl substances. And depending on who you ask, there's maybe 5,000, there's maybe 15,000, maybe there's 50,000. Lots of different varieties. These two substances shown here, being a chemist, I have to put up some chemical formulas. So these two compounds, this is perfluorooctylsulfonate, this is perfluoro octanoic acid, were identified as troublemakers over a decade ago. If you've heard of Hoosick falls, these are the substances that were found in the groundwater, contaminating their drinking water supply. And it was citizen action that led to their discovery and the subsequent cleanup. The semiconductor industry is no longer using these. So they successfully got rid of this, but they're using many, many other things. Next slide. So there's a whole laundry list, and I'm not going to go through this in detail, but just to illustrate that the photolithography process is just one of many, many things that use perfluorinated alkyl substances. And many different shapes and sizes go into it. And one of the significant issues that we're confronted with is that these are considered proprietary compounds. And so what are they? Do they have to report them? Do they have to report them to government agencies? Will they report them to the public? We've heard from other communities nationally that companies are very resistant to disclosing what they're using. So this is from a semiconductor industry document. And David, you said they're very willing to engage in research, but from you read all their documents, this consortium, which includes Micron and many other companies, they are very skeptical about replacing PFAS with other companies. And woe is us, and we've got to use these, and they have the great performance that we need, and put us at a significant competitive disadvantage with, you can read in between the lines, our jurisdiction, United States of America, other jurisdictions were not regulated so well, and sounds like China, maybe. Just saying. So it would take a long time to figure out to come up with a new technology that uses different substances. So, like, what's wrong with PFAS anyway? Well, they are exceedingly toxic. Those two compounds, PFOS, PFOS, and PFOA, the drinking water standard is in parts per trillion. So what's a part per trillion? Well, think about Lake Ontario, a Great Lake. How much would it take to contaminate all of Lake Ontario? About 2,000 gallons to that level. So you're talking about, a milk truck that you see driving down the highway. The contents of one milk truck mixed in with the entire lake. So the EPA is looking hard at these compounds, but it's, the regulatory process is lengthy. And unfortunately, I discovered, what you see listed at the bottom there, is they decided, we've studied this for the semiconductor industry here, and they are not going to promulgate any regulations at this time. And last regulations were promulgated in 1983. I think things may have changed since 1983. So, but it's certainly an active area of research. So going back, here's our factory overview, and I'm going to walk you through the clean water, which David talked about, wastewater component, David mentioned that as well, and then air emissions. So the clean water next, as David mentioned, is coming from Lake Ontario, and these units are called FABs, fabricating facilities. The first one, they do not need to build a new pipeline. If they expand beyond that, they do need to put in another pipeline and pumping facilities. The cost well over $200 million to do that. Who's going to foot that bill? It's not clear. Next. So this is what it looks like. Micron is here. Pipeline from Lake Ontario. There's an intake structure over here, and we'd have to build a whole new pipeline and a new treatment facility down at the lake. And then I also want to point out the wastewater from this facility is gonna head to this treatment plant owned by the county. It's called Oak Orchard. And we'll get into that. I'm not concerned about the supply. Lake Ontario's got a lot of water in it. But what goes into the water is what concerns me. The first step in the wastewater treatment is pre-treatment at Micron's facility. That's on them to build that. And the advice from the semiconductor consortium is to start where it starts, small flows, and focus, zero in on the chemicals where they start off, where you can specifically treat individual types of chemicals, because as the flow gets bigger and bigger, it's harder and harder to treat. And you can see at the bottom of the page talks about high flow rates, very difficult, very expensive, maybe infeasible. So that's the problem. And they have to do all the treatment, basically, because next slide, once it gets out the gate and goes to the county facility, they can't treat it. It will just end up getting sent. Most of it will go into the sludge. Some of it is very soluble and will simply exit via the outfall of the plant and go into the United River. And some of it will get volatilized. But I can assure you none of it will break down. Not the PFAS stuff.
Some of it will get, what was that word you just used?
Volatilized, go into the air.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So wastewater treatment involves aeration, where they're using biology to break down, good old sewage. And the biology is very good at that. And so air is introduced to keep the bacteria that they use happy and thriving. But that does tend to volatilize things. Estimated flow, 8 to 20 million gallons a day. The county has offered to spend $200 million to upgrade the facility. The facility is designed to handle 10 million gallons a day. And so this would be on top of that. Micron, I could not find anything specific on how much they're going to spend on their pre-treatment and so forth, but they say $200 million for roads and infrastructure. I assume that's to pay for piping, and that's so you can see the details about the pipes. We don't really need to know about the size of the pipes, but it will be expensive to do this. Next. Air emissions. So air emissions are going to be, the air emissions from the plant itself will be handled through an incineration process. So that is why they're constructing a natural gas pipeline to the facility, a high pressure 18-inch, I think, diameter pipeline. They will incinerate what comes out of that vacuum. And that's what you need to do in order to destroy these perforated conduits. And I haven't even mentioned any other chemistries, but there are some. I've heard reports that semiconductors use some extremely hazardous things like arsenic and phosphine. Really, really extraordinarily toxic chemicals. So that's the wastewater and air water story. I didn't touch on solid and chemical waste. That's another conversation. Let's talk about electricity. David mentioned this. They're going to use a lot of electricity. So, and we have some kind of competing things going on. So on one hand, they have to get lots of electricity. On the other hand, they're committed, as you can see the quote there, they're committed to using 100% renewable energy. But the quantities are just mind-boggling. Enough to power 500,000 homes for the first two fabs, and the same for the next two fabs. 16 billion kilowatts. That represents an 11% of what we use for the entire state of New York. Great question. Thank you for asking that. What's renewable? So we were at a meeting with Micron, probably 25 people in the room, early November. And someone asked, well, what about nuclear power? Is that renewable? And the woman who was doing the presentation said, well, it's under consideration. Nobody considers renewable to include nuclear. I went to the Department of Energy just to check, and I consider them a pretty unbiased source. Now, wind, solar, hydropower, wave energy, some tidal stuff, but not nuclear. No. What would it take? Yes.
So, go back to the renewable energy.
Yeah.
If some entity is willing to make the investment, right, to create enough facility, renewable energy, power 500 homes,
500,000 homes. Yeah.
That means that those, theoretically, some 500,000 homes do not get that.
You would need to build extra renewable, and that's what this slide is about: is how much stuff you have to build. So I got a friend that works over at SU who teaches about renewable energy, and he did some back of the envelope calculations. Solar, 3 square miles of solar panels. And by the way, that's going to get you through the summer if you hook it up to batteries. Remember, this facility is going to be 24/7. So that's enough during the summertime. In the wintertime, solar doesn't produce that much, but that's where wind can come into play. Wind is more productive by a factor of 5 during the wintertime. So well, you see the number there. It's a lot of wind turbines. Where are you going to pull out those things? Hydropower, it's taken. Sorry. There's no more Niagara Falls up there. And as far as nuclear goes, if you buy into nuclear, well, you can see the numbers for 9 Mile Point, how much they produce. If you were to somehow channel all that power, you could power Micron and have a little bit left over. But I think that energy is already taken, and look at the ages of those plants. 1969, I remember hey, New York Mets. 1969, well, it's a few years ago. Yeah, so these nuclear power plants we have on Lake Ontario, 2 things. They're old and getting older, and there's some parts of it you can keep updating. I hope that the computers are better from 1969, but the reactors themselves degrade. They become embrittled, and eventually you just can't keep them going. You have to shut it down.
Is geothermal an option here?
Do you mean hot or cold?
How is this? I would never.
Well, actually, so Peter mentioned that to me. There is a thing called hot geothermal where you go down a few miles and get hot water, steam, and make electricity. The problem is that you have to go down very deep. And I don't know enough about it to tell you how feasible that is economically to drill, how many wells you have to drill. No one's talking about it, so I would think if it's a viable thing that people would be proposing to do it. If you're in Hawaii, there it is, right at the surface. But here it's much deeper. But it's a possibility. The grid. So there was a recent article about the grid, and the folks that run the grid, which is New York Independent System Operator, are getting rather nervous because there's all these competing demands on the electrical grid. So in addition to Micron, there's some folks talking about building giant hydrogen generation facilities where they use gobs of electricity to make green hydrogen, a very inefficient process. And by the way, New York State is trying to electrify everything under the CLCPA. So electrify our homes and our businesses for heating and cooling, and that we should all be driving EVs, which I'm very supportive of, but it does mean that we got to use up more power. So they're getting nervous about supplying all this energy. So these are my big concerns, all right? I'm not worried about the water. We got a lot of water. PFAS, there's the laundry list, okay? There's thousands of these things. How to regulate them is not easy. Regulatory agencies typically, what do? They go chemical by chemical, or maybe little groups of chemicals. We're talking about 5,000, 15,000 different compounds that companies don't want to tell us what they're using. Range of toxicities. So some of these things are pretty non-toxic and some of them are extremely toxic. And the semiconductor industry is saying we gotta use it, got it. So they're difficult to regulate, they're difficult to treat, and by the way, they're also potent greenhouse gases. And then we just talked about electricity, huge demands on the electrical grid, and where's that energy going to come from? So, I'll end there.
We go back to water.
Yeah.
You said you're not worried about the use of water.
I'm not worried about the consumption of water because we have a lot of water. Yes.
But what happened, what are the comparisons really what comes out of that point in terms of the quality and temperature of the water versus what is taken to Lake Ontario?
That's a great question. I don't know. How good is the pre-treatment process? It all hinges on that, right? How well is Micron going to treat the water coming out of their plant? Because we know that the municipal wastewater plant can't do it. They can't add anything except putting it in the sludge, which does keep it out of the river. But then it's in the sludge. Temperature is, yeah, so they will be cooling things with water. And I haven't researched that aspect of it. Yeah, there'll be waste heat. All that energy that's going in, all that electricity eventually turns into heat. I think so. Right. Like I say, I haven't come across that. I don't know if they're going to put in cooling towers. I know they have. I've seen on the plans, just the pretty pictures. They have cooling ponds, so there will be some emission of heat from cooling ponds at the facility. That's better than sending it into the river.
Question about water, only because I used to think there was enough water. And then I saw a frightening article in the New York Times last Monday about how the Aral Sea evaporated in 40 years. It's the fourth largest lake in the world. And now it's basically a bunch of puddles.
Right.
It was bigger than Lake Ontario.
Right.
So we look at Lake Ontario and just say there's plenty of water, but all of their problems in Russia and in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan came because of irrigation. That doesn't seem like it's really using a lot of water, but it used enough water to drain the lake.
I think it's a fairly arid climate there. So
well, now it is, especially now it is.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is it was the fourth largest lake in the world.
Yeah, I hear that. But I haven't, so the questions about the Aral Sea and how that has disappeared. I don't think, I haven't heard any concerns about the Great Lakes disappearing because the precipitation levels are good
Now,
now.
But do we also talk to other people? Do we know what Toronto has planned or Montreal has planned? We're all using the same water. Is there a mic available?
I'll look.
No, somebody can, I don't want to talk.
Yeah, I mean,
No, it doesn't seem like anybody talks to anybody else. So,
I think that, the water that's taken out will get, most of it will get returned via the wastewater treatment plant.
and more.
And it will be warmed up and it may have some chemicals in it. So there's that issue. But, I have not heard of anyone's concerns about the Great Lakes, disappearing anytime soon, even with climate change.
You said that this, the difference between the waste treatment down on,
Oak Orchard,
no, the one in the city, by the mall.
Metro, yeah,
Yeah, that's sewage.
Correct.
That's poop. Yeah.
yes.
But you said that before, Oak Orchard,
Yes,
they don't know how to clean that kind of water. It's, how are they gonna clean?
so the thing about, so sewage treatment, all these sewage treatment plants are essentially is the same process. Whether it's Metro or Oak Orchard, or there's another one called Meadowbrook Limestone, they're all operated by Onondaga County Water Environment
Is,
Group, and
over at Oak Orchard, are the oaks still there? No Orchard? It's stuff, it's for everything, but the oaks,
the takeaway message is that sewage treatment plant cannot degrade the PFAS.
yeah,
None of them can do it.
Okay.
Good.
dump it in the river room, that they won't give any.
Yeah. I think let's have Dick come.
So I guess I'm the closing act and I'm actually the bearer of whatever good news there is. So I'm gonna be talking about the benefits that come with all of this stuff. You can decide in the end whether they outweigh the costs or not, but anyway, by the way, I did this presentation with my wife about 20 minutes before the meeting, and her first words out of her mouth was, "What does the word chips mean in the Green Chips Act?" And I said, I had no idea. So in the last 5 minutes before I got here, I researched it. And it's actually an acronym. And it means creating helpful initiatives to produce semiconductors. So now you know. So I'm here to talk about the benefits that are the community benefits that are coming with this. And the first thing that we have to understand is that big corporations do not act out of benevolence. When they do good works, it's because they get something in return. And in the case of Micron, there are two sources of those benefits. One is, three sources. We don't even know about the federal CHIPS Act, whether they're going to get money or not, but let's assume for the sake of discussion that they get enough money from the National CHIPS Act to proceed with the project. The second big source is the Green CHIPS Act, which is a New York Act. And I'm going to briefly talk about, what the requirements are of the Green CHIPS Act. First is, there's up to $10 billion in incentives for corporations who qualify. They have to create at least minimal 500 jobs. They have to invest at least $10 billion for a 10-year period in the community or in the state. They have to adopt sustainability measures to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. And they have to commit to worker and community investments, including training and education programs to expand employment opportunities for disadvantaged communities. That's the charity that we get from that, and that's a requirement. Thank you. There's also one other interesting thing about the Green Chips Act, which I thought was interesting, which is that there's a big section about transportation. I can't see it. I assume we're there, right? Next slide.
Yep, there we are.
Yeah, and what they're requiring is charging stations at the facility, which is, you know, a reasonable expectation. But then there's this long list of options for transportation. And the purpose of all of those options is to reduce pollution due to vehicles and due to transportation. And that would include providing transportation for workers to get to the facility. So I'm going to move on to the local piece, which is Onondaga County Industrial Development Agency. And how many of you are familiar with the term pilot? A lot, but not everybody. So the word pilot stands for payment in lieu of taxes. And what it simply means is that a developer comes and says, I want to do some work in the project, and the county gives them essentially a tax break. And the way the tax break works out is that it's over time. And if you look on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see that it's a reduction in taxes that is declining over time. So the first two, in this example, the first 2 years, there's 100% reduction in property tax, and that reduces to 90% and then to 80%. And over the course of the period of the pilot, in this case, this example is from Onondaga County, of 18 years, it slowly declines down. At the end, I think it's about 10%. So that means that at the end of 18 years, or at the 18-year period, the developer has to pay 90% of the taxes. So what we know from the Micron project is that they're getting a 49-year pilot. We do not know the details, and the reason we don't know the details of that pilot is because it's dependent on the final results of the seeker study and the environmental study before the final version is in place. Just a little side note, and I because I was told I had 15 minutes, I didn't include it. SIDA, which is the Syracuse Industrial Development Agency, also has pilots, and their pilots actually have mandatory requirements for local hiring and MWBE hiring of subcontractors. Onondaga County has about 5 or 6 different pilot models, and they have one which is an MWBE, which is totally optional and not required, and is exceedingly modest in its reward compared to their standard pilot. If anybody wants to see those numbers, I'll put them in the slide deck when I put it on the website. So we're looking at the Micron pilot application, and in order to apply for the pilot, Micron had to promise to do certain things. Among them is, complete my little printing here. Among them is that the application to the county said the plant's construction will create 4,500 construction jobs, and I think Dave Sonnenfeld mentioned this, that over 3 years, operation of the plant will involve 1,858 full-time jobs, et cetera, et cetera. We've seen that already. It also requires that that altogether there'll be about 9,000 jobs for the plant over the course of 20 years. Next slide. The next slide shows the breakdown in jobs that will be created over a period of 3 years. And what's interesting about it is you'll notice that the vast majority of the jobs are either in management, white-collar jobs, or engineers, and relatively small numbers of jobs in terms of technicians. Well, if you click, first click, total of 1,337 jobs in year one. This is from the application for the application for the pilot by Micron, but this is their chart. The second year, 207, and the third year, 314. So the total employment would be 1,858, and it'll only be over the course of the 3 years, 669 jobs that'll be at the technician level. So it's not a huge number. Now, what I left out of here, and I don't know because there's a major concern in this community about employment for people who are not engineers and not highly experienced management, is that what are the additional supporting industries that will be created in order to supply and keep that Micron facility going? I know that when Carrier was here, you could multiply the total number of employees of Carrier by some large significant factor to measure its total actual impact on the local economy. We do not know what that number is for Micron. We have to assume that there will be vendors who will be supporting and keeping that plant going, who are going to be local vendors, but we actually don't know what that number is. And I don't know if anybody has done the study to determine that. So on the good news side, I'm assuming that there will be lots and lots of jobs that are not directly tied to direct employment at Micron that will be created, that will create opportunities for people who are blue collar, who are not highly educated and skilled in terms of that.
So the county is projecting an additional 100,000 people coming to the area to work in this facility and related facilities.
Right, those are the same people who think that the aquarium is going to pay for itself. So we know what to do with that number. You know, when they built Destiny, they thought it would be 1 million people a day coming from Canada.
Well, that was all about, they kept working contract and stuff,
Right.
the pilot thing, you know, in lieu of that.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
So, and it never happened.
Yeah.
You never know. No.
Okay, so just moving on, there's a lot of potential good that Micron has committed itself to in terms of community support, and I'm only here, you know, to present it, and where there are questions raised, we can discuss that. So here's how the community investment framework works. The first step in this process, they're calling it the community investment framework, which is actually the result of Micron's financing by the Green Chips Act and financing by the Onondaga County government, is to create something called the Community Investment Fund. And that Community Investment Fund is financed $250 million by Micron and an additional $100 million by the state of New York, and 200, basically 150, another 250 million, or I think it's 250 million by what are called partners. I have no idea who those partners are, but in the document, they're sort of listed as organizations, companies, friends of Micron. It's not clear where that $250 million is coming from, which is actually why I didn't put a solid line there. I put a dotted line because it's a little bit vague about where that money is coming from. But the total is at least $500 million, and that is money that's going to be invested in community benefits through Central New York. And then the next step was to create this committee, which is the advisory committee, and that the work that's being done will cover the following categories: workforce development, education, community assets, community organizations, and affordable housing. Those are the categories that's supposedly going to be addressed by that $500 million fund that came from the community, community investment framework. I could just say I could not find any reference to housing in anything I read about all of this. There's a lot of very specific details that I'll cover very quickly about Micron's investment in education and workforce development and other things, with basically zero mention of housing, zero mention of transportation or any of that. So moving on, next slide. That's the committee. It's probably impossible for you to read all those names. I can tell you that overwhelmingly, they are people who are involved in organizations that serve the Syracuse community. I only found 2 names of people who are actually really local residents living in their communities and are leaders within their communities. One is Bishop Ronald Dewberry, who is the pastor of New Life Temple of Praise. And the second one is Solomon, Hazel Palis, who is the Haudenosaunee Environmental Task Force from Onondaga Nation. And everyone else on that list are associated with organizations, with hospitals, with educational organizations, etc. I know that there is some ongoing discussion in the local community about some unhappiness about this list of this advisory committee. I've tried to find out more details about that and really haven't been able to. So if you take the big broad look at this community investment, don't worry, I'm going to get into the details. That is, if you just put it on basically a flow chart, that's all the categories that are being addressed. And I'm going to go over each one specifically so that you can actually see what they are one at a time. Next slide. So in the case of OCC, there's $5 million from Micron and $5 million from the county to create a clean room training center at OCC and to upgrade curriculum at OCC to provide for technicians and possibly engineers who would finish their degrees at SU or et cetera to be employed at Micron. And if you look at Syracuse University, there is an institute at Syracuse University called the Daniello Institute for Veteran and Military Affairs. And basically the charge there is to upgrade skills of veterans and so that they could actually be eligible to get jobs and work at Micron and other companies. And the goal there is essentially to create 1,500 jobs for veterans in the next 9 years. And that's being funded by Micron. And also Micron will be establishing an internship program to recruit especially recruiting focus on veterans and people from economically and socially disadvantaged communities. Next. Project labor agreement, that was actually mentioned. A project labor agreement is an agreement between a company and a construction company about the rules of the road for how the work is done. And within the Micron project labor agreement with the construction companies, there is a lot of detail there, and I'm just going to have to read it with you. The first one is called helmets to
hard hats.
Helmets to hard hats, and what it is, it's an initiative to get veterans into the construction trade, and like Micron will be supporting that. There'll be an interesting part of it, which is they're asking for 1 cent per skilled working hour that would be collected by Micron and would be given to the Pathways to Apprenticeship program, which is run by the city of Syracuse, to create skilled apprenticeships for the trades. There will be, and this is the one I found interesting, Micron will work to ensure that 30% of construction spend and 20% of ongoing eligible operating spend is awarded to companies that are owned by people from economically and socially disadvantaged communities. I'm going to get back to that in a minute. And next is priority given to MWBE and service disabled veteran-owned businesses. And finally, Micron will, quote unquote, encourage construction contractors and subcontractors to use Syracuse Build as first source model to identify candidates for hiring from disadvantaged communities. What do you think about those two terms? Encourage. Micron will be working to ensure and encouraging. I think that is pathetically weak. That is waffling. That is a lack of commitment. And I think they need to be held to account and held from their feet to the fire. Those terms just jumped right off the page at me and said, They are not, there's no commitment there whatsoever. This is,
You said, you used the word promise. What's promise?
actually, it's not even at the level of promising. It's like, yeah. Okay, I just want to point that out. I think this is one place where the community needs to be very vocal and make sure that they act on this and actually fulfill a commitment. Next slide. Education. $100 million investment over 10 years in STEAM. I think this is really, you know, that big building on the corner of East Adams and Salinas Street has been vacant for 30 years. And the fact of the matter is that plumbers can earn more money than doctors these days. There's an old joke that the plumber comes to fix the doctor's house because his faucet is leaking, and he's there for 20 minutes and he hands the doctor a bill for like $150, and the doctor says, "I don't even get paid that much," and the plumber says, "I didn't either when I was a doctor." So I think this is a really good use of money by Micron. The second is partnership with SU to support the new diversity faculty to focus on quantum and chips cluster. They want engineers, and if they can get them locally, that's even better. They don't have to pay all those transfer expenses, right? To have them move to Syracuse. And finally, finally, expand strategic partnerships with regional universities, which is a vague term. I don't know what that means. And finally, the next, which is community engagement. And I think that's the last one. No, one more after that. So community engagement, the first one says that, I think it's, can't figure the number, but it's a commitment to YMCA. I think it's $100 or $200 million to YMCA to expand access to quality childcare. What's very interesting about that is that embedded in the detail of the Green Chips Act of New York is actually a requirement for childcare, that childcare be provided. So this is not an act of generosity. This is actually a requirement from the bill they signed to get all of the financial benefits of the Green Chips Act.
This is 500,000.
500,000, and then I think there was another 500,000 to most.
Yep.
Which is there to build this exhibit, which I think is actually there now, and also to provide this camp that the most has these camp facilities. And then the last two are $100,000 investment in, in venture funding to support and attract new businesses to Central New York, and quarterly public opportunity meetings with the community, which we actually have been ongoing. I have to give them credit. With all the complaints about Micron, they have been willing to meet with the community, even if we don't believe a word they said. Right? And finally, the last two pieces, and then I'm done. So other Micron commitments is a workforce innovation consortium with a goal to implement a multidimensional and inclusive approach to workforce development, upskilling, and professional retention. And then $10 million in deposits with minority depository institutions. A minority depository institution is a bank or credit union that is 51% owned by a minority or with a board of directors that is a minority board of directors. And commission to study, and this is the one that I thought was the weakest of everything, which is they are going to be required to set up a commission to do a study to understand the specific and unique hurdles facing the Syracuse region in order to identify policies that support better infrastructure, housing opportunities, and social and financial inclusion. Right.
I just about said it all.
We need a commission. And finally, a chip camp. So they're planning to, no-cost STEM education program for middle and high school students. 70 to 100 students per week will attend. So there's a lot there's a lot of very specific stuff that they have committed to doing. There's some really important specific stuff that they're not committed to doing. There's some very vague and general stuff that they talk about doing. No mention that I could find anywhere about addressing the housing issue. No mention that I could find anywhere about addressing the issues of transportation within the Central New York community. So that's it. That's my piece.
Of all the money, 100K, 3 million, 3 billion. Oh, not today, not on the first day, spread out over how long?
20 years.
And see, it's not nearly as much when you look at inflation, when you look way out into the future,
Right.
20 years,
Right.
Yeah, they do the division of 9,000 jobs created totally over 20 years. It's not even a lot of jobs.
Right.
Even the math,
Right.
it's not a lot.
I'm sorry, Barry, and then Don. Barry.
Congratulations for bringing up housing issues. I'm very severe. Thanks for that. Thanks for that. But now I'd like to back down. And because as they have said, they don't say it, but you really were, you're 50% wrong. You're overestimating the problem. That still leaves an awful lot of problems for us. And so my question is, discounting what you said to some extent, although I won't take it. Do the people that are surviving know we should set up chairs here? No. Yeah. Do you think the people that are surviving, for example, know what you told us? Or know the information?
That would be conjecture on my part.
Could you summarize the question for our Zoom audience?
I think that the question is, does OSIDA understand what I just presented? I doubt it. I don't think they have that they're an agency that is looking at developing industry and economic growth. That's their whole focus. And so I would expect, I shouldn't speak for them, but my expectation is that they're looking at dollar signs.
How many people are in those people in planning? How many people are?
Let's see.
I don't know how many people are. The question is how many people are on the board of OSIDA and the Syracuse Industrial Development Agency. I don't know.
Wow.
It's a small number, I think.
Yeah, 100% of people plan all this nonsense. I've always been people.
Well, it's
Over again. Why would anybody listen? What is it? It's all it's all money. It's corporate fascism is what this is. It's crazy. Why would he it's not even BS, it's only plot. It's not even genuine BS. Who's gonna believe this? It's nothing but bad news. Crew get the money like you said. It's all about them making it. I love to know who those people are on board.
it's all about economic development, right?
Do this.
Yeah.
So let me partially answer your comment, which is that what I hear in your question is why are we doing this and what are the bigger processes behind that?
Who are you addressing?
Yes, no to you.
Oh.
And I'd like to add a couple of things to our presentation and conversation today. One is that why we're all here talking about this in the first place is that this is a national security as well as a development issue. there is a bipartisan support at the federal level for what is referred to as re-onshoring semiconductor manufacturing in the United States. What that means is that Republicans and Democrats and the Biden administration all agree, at least a sufficient number of them agree, that this is a strategic priority that the U.S. bring the electronics manufacturing back to the U.S. Today it is in China, it is in Korea, it's in Japan. That's a big driver of this. So that's one partial response.
I understand that those chips are gonna go into weapons.
There is that as well. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Second point, which is the timeline and the processes. At the local level, OSIDA is the lead agency in shepherding this project through the review process. The review process is still in the early stages. So there's a state environmental review. At the same time, Onondaga County is developing plans, including for transportation and housing and so forth. There's a lot of activity on this right now, but this is not a done deal. There will be additional opportunities for public input and comment. And the fundamental is that there's as big as the numbers are, there's a limited amount of funds available, and there's over 400 applications at the federal level for funding under this National Chips and Science Act. It is not a done deal, and we're talking about it today because it's proposed that will have, if it is realized, have a major impact on this area, but it's not yet a done deal.
So I'm getting excited about it.
Stay tuned for further comments.
Stay tuned.
Then all those houses that been torn down on the site, torn down on speculation. Yeah. They paid $650,000 for a house that was on in Syracuse back.
And so the comment was about the housing that has been torn down on what has been referred to as the White Pines
Commerce Park.
Commerce Park. Thank you. There are proposals today to develop new commercial housing in that area, not on that same facility. The county has been working on this development project for decades.
Yeah.
So it's not a new development in terms of presenting these possibilities to the community. If this one doesn't go forward, likely they will be out there looking for other tenants for that facility. So
I mean, they're not going to build it here; they'll find another place.
there are other manufacturers that, and there have been some in the past that we're looking at the site. If this doesn't go forward, the county would be in a position to say, well, we did this for Micron and it didn't work out, but now we have this facility available to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go back to the issue of wastewater.
Yeah.
Are there any plans, like you mentioned one in Albany, is there a comparable plan in Albany where we know what the wastewater coming from that chip plant is looking like at this point?
There's a plant that's going to be built in Malta, which is outside of Saratoga Springs.
Going to be built.
Going.
Are there any instances where the wastewater can be evaluated for how good a job they're doing in the pre-treatment?
Yeah, so if this were my full-time job, I'd be able to answer better. But so the EPA has done a study on semiconductor industry, and they concluded that they didn't need to develop regulations. Now, how good was the study? I don't know. What's been tested? I don't.
Well, let me add to that. There is an update with it. The question is, I heard two questions actually. One is, are there existing facilities where it's known what is in the waste stream? The second thing I heard some discussion of was what the current regulations are from the US EPA. The US EPA now is publicizing draft regulations for the first time for reporting under the toxic release inventory some of the thousands of PFAS substances. So there is some movement. It's very slow, as Don mentioned earlier, but there's a step toward regulation. To your first part of your question, there are semiconductor facilities around the world, including operated by Micron. The question, to answer that question in terms of PFAS substances, part of the challenge is the monitoring capacity that exists today for detecting those substances and for evaluating those samples from that. And that is very rudimentary and it's very expensive. So those operations today are scattered around the world. So the facilities exist, the capacity to measure and the actual activity to measure, in my understanding, is fairly limited today. But the knowledge that would exist would be by the industry who's doing that. And whether that comes out in the environmental review process, we have yet to see. There is an initiative at the national level to waive the National Environmental Protection Act for approving these projects. There's a lot of interest in getting these projects started before the November election. So that's another part of the timeline that exists with these projects.
I would just two pieces of context, I think, more of a question. One, for New York State, the PFAS discharge, there's also pending legislation for discharge disclosure. So any industrial facility that does that, any industrial facility that is again, there's legislation that also part of the state. So put that in your head.
But it is in some.
It's pending legislation. So they're depending on who can regulate, state content regulating for some see regulations that adapted, but legislation be stronger than that. So the language section. Second piece is just moving across the data is a little disingenuous to describe it as a pending project. It's of those 400 applicants, only one of them had the president of the United States come in, get press releases, do giant things around it, etc. It's gonna happen. So the context of what it's going to be is that taking the project and making it that. That's the focus of what needs efficient. There's not going to be any prevention by having this finances fall apart time, which I expected was that the project is going to get rid of. So I here to see it. So it's really about making it as much even better. That should be the focus. It's not really.
So there's a comment that this project, the proposed Micron project, is inevitable. We can disagree about that. Micron itself is applying under the same federal CHIPS Act for funding for a different project in Boise in its facilities there. So they're competing with themselves for the same funding. We'll see in time whether it is built, and I've actually not heard any opposition to the project, and what the discussion today and in other fora that I've seen over the last several months has been, how can we as a community and how can other communities around the country where these facilities might be built engage with the process and with the manufacturers to do this in as sustainable a way as possible. So I'm not hearing that opposition, but I am hearing maybe this is partially what you're saying as well. How can we make these projects, if they're or when they are built, as sustainable as possible?
They're not hearing opposition, they're talking.
I just wondered if there's all these proposed projects in Syracuse, looks like maybe it's a preferred one. What was Micron's reasoning in choosing here and maybe Boise? And I don't need it from the NIMBY, not my backyard perspective, but does it make sense to come here? Is it the water? Is it
The water.
available? Why did Micron put it here, and is this a good place for it, if it's a national need?
Well, you're asking us to speak to Micron. The question is, why is Micron setting up shop here?
What was their reason?
Well, I can't get inside their heads, but I can speculate that the availability of a reliable water supply was a big factor. Perhaps the fact that we're not about to sink under the ocean like Florida is may have factored into it as well. We're kind of insulated for climate change. So, you know,
You have to factor in the Green Chips Act.
green chips.
I don't know if
Yeah.
the state is offering the kind of incentives for chip manufacturing that New York is offering, but that's a huge part of it. There's really, I didn't talk about the incentives, didn't have time, but there's a lot of money for Micron from the state that
Mhm.
going back.
Yeah.
I heard milligrams on the radio, how important leadership in regulating feedback. And then the next segment of the show, he was really talking about my plan. So I'm just wondering what conversation what we might do to that.
You want to? Yeah.
So the comment referenced a conversation that our junior senator from New York, Kirsten Gillibrand, had with Grant Rieger on radio show a couple of weeks ago. I heard that also, and was also struck by those two, the juxtaposition of her being one of the sponsors and advocates for the Federal Chips and Science Act, and also talking about existing PFAS challenges in her own area, Hoosick Falls, just outside of Albany. And indeed, it is a striking challenge. And I have the same question, whether she is as aware as perhaps many of us would hope that she was about the PFAS profile of semiconductor manufacturing. It's not clear to me how much she has looked into that aspect of semiconductor manufacturing. The image of electronics manufacturing, we hear this term clean rooms, is that it's a clean and green industry. Fact is, it's an industry that uses a lot of chemicals and for which, some of which are highly toxic, and looking at how you address those is really critical to addressing the potential environmental and health impacts of those facilities. So it's an area that I hope that there are questions and conversations that involve both of our senators from New York, both of whom, especially Chuck Schumer, who was instrumental in getting support across the aisles for these kinds of projects.
David, I'd like to ask you again, I'm sorry for my immediate response about opposition. I personally oppose it because I'm afraid. And also see it disrupting. I'm not going to oppose to the green chip plant, but at that scale for this community. But a more technical question, and I think probably from the answer, I don't. I've heard many times that the EPA tests, there are many new compounds developed annually, many. The EPA does not have the ability to test many of them. And they test maybe none, hardly any, in conflict with each other.
So the question is about the EPA or any agency to test for these chemicals. I can tell you that the testing for individual compounds at part per trillion levels is difficult, very difficult, and very expensive. And you're testing for the compounds that you know about. So this has always been the quandary of environmental chemistry, where you're trying to monitor for chemicals. If you're trying to monitor for things you don't know about, you can't, right? So there is a test called total organic fluorine, which is an inclusive kind of test. It doesn't tell you exactly what's there, but it does give you a total sum of fluorinated organic compounds. And there's been in talking to the people in the National Coalition are advocating for that kind of testing, because at least it includes everything. But the difficulty is trying to assess risk. And the risk is based on the quantity of the chemical and the toxicity of the chemical. And the toxicity varies greatly from compound to compound. Many have thousands of compounds. And on top of that, the industry doesn't want to reveal what it is, although they talk to each other about it. So that's an area I think it would be good to talk to Senator Gillibrand about, is promoting clarity and that companies must disclose what they're using. How else are we going to control it?
Can I say one thing quickly? The fact is that most of the chips that are created are not created in this country. I guess Taiwan creates a huge percentage of the very highest level of chips. If China takes that over, or if China decided not to sell those to us or give those to us somehow, we would be in really, really bad. They could be putting their knee on our neck. And so it's really necessary for the United States to up its game and at least figure out some way to bring chips back, manufacturing into our country, so we're not left vulnerable. And we now are extremely vulnerable.
Yeah, I think I read that the United States produces 10% of the chips.
10%.
That's it. 90% of the chips that are made in the world are not made in this country.
You know, could I add?
And Taiwan is a large percentage.
Oh, you say, oh, it's my, what's the difference if China has, this will be claiming, but my comment, what's the difference if China has their knee on my neck or Micron? What's the difference?
I'd rather Micron than China.
You're talking about the war.
So we're kind of out of time. If we can wrap up.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. So a couple thoughts. We will do our best to stay on top of this. Elaine Denton is our webmaster. She's done a great job with some places. Go and look at our website, look at the Micron resource page. Elaine will continue adding stuff to that. The next several months are going to be critical. We want to think about raising these issues today with particularly our county and state level legislators. There's some new county legislature members. OSIDA is reports to Ryan McMahon, who's not going to listen, but some of the legislators will. So think about talking to county and state level legislators. Think about letters to the editor, and go to our webpage, and we'll continue to try to stay in touch with this issue.
And the webpage is once more
CNY Solidarity.org.